Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Love seeing those numbers climb up. This is great. We'll just give everyone a few more seconds.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hope you're having a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be.
Hi, Dennis. Welcome. Hello from Canada.
And hello from the US. Hope all the Americans joining had a good sort of extended weekend.
Oh, we have Martin joining from Germany. We have Shrikant joining from Chennai, India. We have Helder joining from Dallas. Yay, another Canadian. Love it. Toronto. Ooh, another one from Brazil. Hey, Mike. Okay, awesome. I think we can let others just trickle in, but I don't want to wait to get started because this is a super exciting topic. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Neha Varshneya, and I am Gatsby's Director of Product Marketing. And today I have our very own Sam Bhagwat, that is Gatsby's co-founder as well as Chief Strategy Officer. So Sam and I were just chatting a little earlier today, and I was telling him that honestly, I love today's topic. And it's because when I got started at Gatsby last year, this is what I found myself asking over and over and over again when I was truly trying to learn our space. And that question was, how do you go about actually designing a modular web architecture? There are so many important technology decisions that one needs to make that, let's face it, it can be a little bit overwhelming, or a lot overwhelming in my case. And I remember I was asking like Sam 1,000,001 questions before. It was like, how does someone know if they're supposed to use React or Vue, or are they supposed to use Gatsby or Next, or is it like Gatsby Cloud, Netlify, or is it Vercel? Do they go with Contentful or Sanity? Is it Shopify or BigCommerce? You get the gist of it. There's a ton of questions, but what I'm truly excited about today is to hear Sam's take on it, because I know, Sam, when you were writing your book, Modular, the Web's New Architecture, oh, there it is. So grab your copy, folks, if you haven't read it already. I know when, Sam, you were writing this book, you actually chatted with like dozens and dozens of tech leads to really gather all of their insights on crafting architectures that have really solid components, but also like hang together really, really well, which is obviously very important. So for folks tuning in, all you need to know if you're joining us at this moment is that you're going to want to stay for the duration of this webinar, because Sam is going to be walking us through and outlining categories and criteria and tricks and tools that teams have actually found to integrate important workflows for really making these choices quickly and with low risk. So without further ado, Sam, I want to turn it over to you so we can kick things off.
Thanks, Neha, and again, thanks everyone for coming and joining us today. I hope that today's kind of I hope today's session is going to be relatively interactive. There's the first thing that I want to say, sort of starting off, is that there's so many different types of websites that people need to build, but they do fall in sort of a few specific categories. And I think what we're kind of going to do over the next 25 or 30 minutes is walk through some scenarios and see in that scenario what's the right architecture. There's not a right global architecture, although there are some good things that are principles that are kind of fairly universal. But I've actually picked a couple of examples of tech leads that I've kind of gotten to know pretty well, who have designed, who sort of were leading specific projects and then in charge of designing the architecture for that specific project. And we're going to kind of walk through, how did they make those decisions? because I think that in these couple examples that we're going to walk through, you'll see a bit of kind of lessons for you. And there's going to be some time there's going to be some time in a little bit for sort of questions as well. So if you've got questions, just put them in the chat, and then we'll get to them in a few minutes. I'm also my gut kind of take or assumption is that if you're coming here, you are kind of fairly involved in making technical decisions in your agency or your company, or for the projects that you're working on, maybe as a freelancer. And so my hope is that you'll kind of come away from this webinar with some ideas of maybe a decision that you've been kind of thinking about and not sure how to make, or maybe you're thinking about a project in the future and you don't have to make the decision right now, but you will have to in a couple months. And so it can kind of get your wheels spinning. Or maybe it's a decision that you've made in the past and you're thinking about it, like, do I want to stick with that? Or, maybe do you want to go a different way? So yeah, let's kind of dive in, and we'll play tech lead for a day. So the first company and the first project that we're going to walk through is a company called Jackson. So this is a D2C company, so selling men's jewelry online. We're going to skip back to mid-2021 when this company had a few $1 million of sales, and they've so you just here's what their website sort of used to look like, just to give you a sense of what we're playing with here. And so the idea, they come to your agency and say, hey, we want better design, we want faster performance, we want to improve conversions beyond the baseline. So you're the California-based web agency. You typically build apps with React, but this is kind of your first headless e-commerce project. You've got this experienced tech lead, Trevor Heath. So you're Trevor. And then Trevor is working alongside a junior dev who's just a few months out of boot camp. And so that's your project team. And let's talk a little bit about, before we kind of dive into the specific choices technologically that you're going to have to make along the way, the site architecture, right? So it's an e-commerce site, and e-commerce sites, if you've worked on them or if you haven't, they tend to have a fairly uniform architectures in terms of, when I say an architecture in this context, what I really mean is like a page structure, right? They have landing pages that have some information about the products in general, or the company in general, right? There's category pages, and in this case, that's types of jewelry, right? Specific product pages, and then the cart checkout flow. So they're shifting from Shopify to what they want to do, like a headless Shopify. And again, React is a pretty non-negotiable for them. So there's a few questions that kind of came up over the course of the project, and I'll just kind of walk through what they were first, and then we're going to take them sort of one at a time. And as you're seeing these questions, just think about what decision criteria would you use, kind of based on your experience, for how you would make these different choices. Right? CMSs, frameworks, hosting, product variants for them was a little bit of a tricky issue because Shopify's out of the box setup didn't work as well as they would have hoped it would. Project risks are always a great thing to be thinking about, right? Just what is the biggest project risk here? And it was something they thought about a lot. And then they also wanted to shift. They also wanted to be in a model where they didn't just provide value up front. They sort of provided value up front by rebuilding the site, but also then provided value over time, which helped kind of even the revenue out over time as an agency, right? And so let's kind of tackle these one in a row. I know we just saw a list of decisions, but we're going to get to them kind of one by one. So the first thing, as Trevor kind of actually maybe we'll go back. So this is kind of the interactive part. There's a list of these questions. These are going to kind of come up over the course of the project. But before we dive into how they actually address them, let's spend a little bit of time where we kind of crowdsource this and kind of ask all of you, how would you make the decisions here? What criterion would you use? Would you go one way versus the other way for things? And given kind of what we've presented so far about the project, right? So you don't need to answer all the questions, but maybe just pick one question, whatever's most interesting to you, and then like leave that answer in the chat. So again, here are the questions. And I hope this kind of gets everybody's brain kind of spinning around, hey, a project has a fixed set of questions, architectural questions to answer, and we need to think through how to make these decisions. And while you're writing, I think we can take a look at the chat and answer any questions that came up. So Kamal asked any thought of user load at this point in the project. They weren't necessarily thinking about user load because they knew they wanted to go with a Jamstack solution that was kind of scalable. Because Jamstack solutions are all basically scalable out of the box, so they weren't thinking about that as much. Yes, Lorraine asked headless CMS or no. Yes, they definitely wanted to go with like a headless architecture. And if anyone has any answers to any of these questions, I see people popping the questions in the chat. If they have any answers to the questions or how they've made some decisions in the past, please pop that in the chat as well. Lester talks about the keep it simple KISS principle. That's a good one. Yeah, Ali kind of asks if there's things their team is already familiar with. And there's hosting platforms they already like or dislike. That's a great, team familiarity is a great question here. In this case, they had familiarity with React, but they didn't have familiarity with Gatsby Next or any other kind of meta framework. Okay, I think we've had a Neha, anything from the questions or the answers that are sticking out to you?
I love what Wilson just said. Framework wise, either Next.js or Gatsby would work because both handle SSR and static pages, which we will need. The decision might vary depending on what the team is familiar with. And Tonya, what's their budget? Are they starting small and scaling, or are they already quite big?
Yeah. And I think their budget was on the smaller side for the project, but then they wanted for the agency wanted to sort of craft a relationship where they'd be able to continue to add value over time. Okay, I think we've had some good thoughts to kind of folks popping in questions and answers here. So let's kind of go on to how they handled this situation. Okay, so first kind of decision they had to make was, do we need a CMS? And the decision they made, and sort of like a recap, this is a important question because e-commerce is kind of powering the majority of the site, but there are a few landing pages that are important, and so they decided that these landing pages are important enough that we are going to need to edit them over time. They felt that Contentful was kind of the standard headless CMS, kind of the most well-used one, and so they decided to go with Contentful. I think which is a pretty good sort of reasonable way of making a decision. Then they were deciding about the framework, and they decided to go with Gatsby. And the reason they specifically went with Gatsby was A, they wanted to work with React, and then B, performance was really important for them. And so Gatsby is sort of the most performance optimized framework. And so they decided that, hey, as a result, we want to choose Gatsby. For hosting, they decided that they wanted to go with Gatsby Cloud. And a lot of that was because they were really ramping up on Gatsby as a framework, and they wanted to make sure if they ran into roadblocks, there would be someone there who understood not just the hosting side of things, but also the framework side of things, right? So they felt it was a risk reduction exercise for them to go with kind of Gatsby Cloud. So product variants, now there's a number of different ways they could have handled this, but they decided to actually use Google Sheets with the Gatsby plugin and sort of store all their product variants in Google Sheets and then pull that into their Gatsby site. And the reason they did that was just the familiarity of the spreadsheet interface for entering in the data that they needed. And that was, it was a very interesting choice. I think we don't see as many folks going with that, but it was something that, as we followed up with them, worked really well for them. So the biggest project risk, and this is an important question to be thinking about during projects, right? It's like, okay, great, we've thought about the decisions we need to make, and now we need to think about what aren't we thinking about? What haven't we considered here? The retrospective questions like, hey, if this project gets delayed, or if we run into problems, like what caused those problems, right? Asking that question up front. And so when they asked this question, what they thought about is that basically any sort of headless Shopify thing adds a little bit of complexity with the cart checkout flow. And so they had Trevor address that to make sure there's like a seamless user experience. And then the second project risk, right? Junior dev, fresh from boot camp, just knows React, is doing Gatsby for the first time. Anytime there's someone that's super junior on the project, you have to think about how do you help them be the most productive so the project can go smoothly. And they actually came up with a pretty innovative approach with Storybook, where the dev actually could, spend a lot of their time not needing to know Gatsby and just building React components in Storybook, which is a really interesting kind of innovative approach. We definitely recommend folks trying this approach if they haven't before, especially with folks that are, very familiar with React, but maybe not as familiar with Gatsby. And kind of see, hey, how does this work for you and your organization? Just having them in Storybook building components. And then the last question was how they continued to provide value over time. And so what they actually did was that after they shipped the project, and we'll talk a little bit about the results in a second, but they kind of continually, so they shipped sort of a fairly minimal version of the site, and then they built modules over time and kind of tested whether these new modules that they would add improve the conversion rates. So like this is like a fair pricing module, and they used Heap as a analytics tool that gave them really good visibility into whether specific modules increase, like what the effect of those modules is on conversion. And so as a result, they were able to kind of shift the revenue from just kind of an upfront project revenue to kind of, hey, upfront project revenue plus kind of like an ongoing maintenance subscription fee, which is really helpful for them. So kind of recapping the architecture here, you can kind of see what it looks like. This is, basics, obviously, but a pretty good guide to what it would look like if you drew the architecture diagram. And then the results, right? One of the most important part of the parts of the project. With the faster performance, right, the conversion doubled from 1% to 2%, which added millions of dollars of new revenue. The project actually only took a couple of months for these two devs, so it was pretty affordable for Jackson. It's a huge ROI on the project. They were very glad they did the migration. And some lessons learned, right, from the architecture, which is, again, think about the biggest project risks up front. Web performance really matters, right? Faster websites really do increase conversions a lot. And then the other thing is that there were a number of decisions they had to make, but some of them would have been okay either way. It could have been okay with another CMS if they'd gone with Sanity, probably would have been fine, right? Cool. So awesome. Great. We could walk through that kind of like one example, and again, hope it's kind of like spurring some ideas and thoughts in your head as you're kind of thinking about the architecture decisions that you might be making for projects that you're working on. We're going to now launch into a slightly different kind of company. It's more of a bricks and mortar company, although they do a lot of their business online. And we can kind of see, we can kind of see how this tech lead walked through their decisions on the project. So,
Sam, before we jump into Wave Direct, I just want to give the audience maybe a couple minutes to see if they have any questions for Sam as it relates to Jackson and this mini case study he just ran us through.
Yeah. Oh, let's do that. Let's do that. That's a great idea, Neha. I'll pull up the chat questions. Anything that sticks out to you from the questions, Neha?
Yes, we have a question here from Kamal. By performance, is it measuring latency or the economic aspect of performance?
So they did both. They used Core Web Vitals to assess their Lighthouse score and their average page load speed over time for their whole site for individual pages. But they also looked at the conversion rate, the economic impact that you looked at. They looked at, hey, of the visitors that come to the site, what percentage end up making a purchase? And because they have fairly high ticket dollar items, right, like $150 jewelry, that number starts out pretty low, like 1%, but then they were able to actually double it to 2%.
Amazing. And Kamal has a follow-up question here. And how does Gatsby help with load testing / performance?
So we've, there's a ton of details, and we have some performance webinars. One of our solutions engineers, Grayson, did a really great sort of deep dive a couple months back. But the short version of the story is there's 100 things that you can do to optimize performance, and Gatsby handles many of them on the framework level, so that you don't have to optimize them as a developer using the framework. From images to to page transitions and so forth.
Awesome. Antonia has a question. Did you test conversion continually throughout once launched and decide at any point during development that this was a good path to be on? Or did you just wait until the project was completed and test modules then? And then Antonia followed up with, my question is a bit confusing, but what I mean is, were you verifying the decisions throughout the process, or did you wait till the end for the proof, brackets, in terms of revenue increase?
Right. So that's a great question. What Trevor did was he basically the project itself, because it was a lift and shift, it was a redesign of the site. So when they moved from Shopify to Gatsby, they weren't able to test conversion until they switched the whole thing over. And so they built the whole site, they switched the whole thing over, and then they tested sort of before versus after. And that was the 1% versus 2% number. And then over time, as they were iterating on the Gatsby site and building these additional modules and testing those out, they continued to measure that performance over time.
Sweet. Shrikant is asking, what are the landing pages need? Oh, sorry. What if the landing pages need some components that are personalized?
I'm going to guess what you're saying is like, if you need if you're like, hey, this product needs a specific component that other products don't have. I don't believe they encountered any of those particular situations. And in general, like the 10-second version of advice is that, if you have like 1,000 SKUs or 10,000 SKUs, it's best to try to use components that you're going to be able to use over all of the different SKUs, right? Just because it's going to have more of an impact. If you have 5 or 10 SKUs, maybe do personalized, components.
Cool. I think that's all for questions right now, Sam. Let's jump into Wave Direct, which is a very different case study from the Jackson one.
Okay, yeah, let's cool. So thanks everybody for your questions. So Wave Direct's a bit of a different animal. Canadian telecom provider, very bricks and mortar. Here's their kind of old website. You can see this is a bit old school. So they're providing rural Ontario with high-speed internet, and so the project goals here are somewhat similar but somewhat different. So organic traffic was a big driver for them. Their SEO to try to drive that organic traffic, right? Conversions were also a thing, although for them it was about converting someone from a lead to having a conversation with the sales team, rather than sort of like to a customer directly. So Touchless, which is a focused web agency in Canada, was the team here. Kevin Gervais was the CTO, and he had, I think, a team of about 3-4 folks who were working with him on that. So some of the project decisions that came up along the way of this project, right? So again, same thing. Do we need a CMS? Same question. Framework, content for SEO, right? They had this tricky thing around, how can we tell if visitors are actually someone we can serve? If someone's in the US, we can't really help them because we're only in like rural Ontario, which is, just one state in Canada, or province. How do we optimize page load speed? Converting in-market visitors to the sales team, right? And so again, like, let's talk about how you would think about this, right? How would you make these decisions? And again, pick a question, write your answer in the chat. Either if it's a question that's important to you, or like you have some thoughts about how you've maybe done this in the past, or how you would do it in the future. We can take another look at the chat here. Province, okay. Thanks, Chris. And Chris says it is a province instead of a state. I'm putting. Yeah, any questions or comments that are sticking out to you from the chat?
We have one here that says, we use Gatsby at our university and have chosen the framework over Next.js. We're going through a web transformation program at the moment and find it great to work with. Absolutely love hearing that.
Thanks. I see.
I see some other comments coming in here. What types of content for SEO? I assume blog posts, etc., as well as the product service. Fanny saying CMS is needed for SEO content paired with a static site generator, maybe. John is saying we probably don't need a CMS.
Yeah. So and Antonia, that's a great question to ask. What type of content? And I think we'll get to that when we get to this question. And then, Fanny, I think that's a good point, because SEO is kind of doubling down on content. We definitely do need a CMS. In the previous project, it was kind of an auxiliary thing, and this project is kind of much more central.
We have a comment here, Sam, that says, I really don't get how we make the decision of whether or not we need a CMS.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So usually the best way to make that decision, I'm actually looking at the next comment here from Tomas, which is a CMS is probably needed if there are more than a handful of editors. And that's a good way of thinking about it. If you have more than like maybe one editor, or like if content workflows are important for your project, if people are going to be spending a lot of time writing and editing content, then you need to be thinking about using a headless CMS, right? Because otherwise your alternatives are maybe markdown files or something like that. And, maybe you can get like one person to use that even if they're not technical, but it's just going to be tricky. That's going to be pretty hard. And if they're going to spend a lot of time there, you just want to think about the CMS for making the content editor workflows, better. Also, if you have structured content, right, the more structured your content is, the more you have objects that have relationships to each other, the more you need to be thinking about using a headless CMS versus alternatives. Yeah. And looks like Lester is asking whether the development team needed to figure out how the company typically linked kind of potential customers back to the marketing team. Yeah, that was actually we'll get to that, but like doing the SEO analytics up front was a little bit of was something that they needed to do before they dived into the project. Okay, I think we can probably dive in. Thanks everybody for your thoughts and comments. And I think, we're going to get to some of these as we go through the questions. So again, here's what happened. Here's what Kevin did. Again, the questions. So the first one was, do we need a CMS? And the answer was yes, because we are going to need blog posts to increase our organic user acquisition. They also wanted to do a lot with programmatic data. So they wanted to basically auto-generate specific kinds of pages. And as a result, they wanted to use Sanity because they found it easier to feed the data into their CMS. And then maybe edit in the CMS and then generate pages programmatically from that. So what should we use for the framework? Again, performance was really important to them, so they picked Gatsby. In this case, performance was kind of doubly important for them because the faster their pages were, the better they would rank in their Google search results, and the better they ranked in their Google search results, the more organic traffic they would get. So it wasn't just converting existing website visitors, it was actually also acquiring new website visitors. And so Gatsby is not just part of their conversion strategy, right? It was also part of their SEO strategy. So they did take a look at some of the queries that they wanted to kind of direct into their website. And I think they're a little bit small here, but hopefully you can see them. They have a lot to do with like rural internet in Ontario. And so they wrote, for example, this blog post about rural internet in Ontario, and so it was fairly focused content or fairly focused queries, and so they were able to write blog posts by just doing an analysis of the types of traffic that were already getting to them and that they wanted more of. And then they really invested here in this React component to kind of figure out whether a visitor was a good target, like whether they lived in the right area. It involved, so it wasn't just, hey, we developed a great React component. It also involves a lot of data cleaning. So it was a bit of an investment, but this kind of became their center of their efforts towards conversion, along with their Gatsby site, which so they actually went kind of above and beyond here. Not only did they sort of build with Gatsby, but they actually used a tool called RudderStack that helped aggregate a lot of the analytics trackers they were using. For folks that have done performance optimization or like really care about performance, one of the things that often slows down your site after you use Gatsby, and that really helps. But then sometimes what happens is you have a lot of page trackers, and that slows you down. And so they use something that helped them aggregate those trackers. And then again, it was kind of a data-focused approach. They thought about the fields and information they needed to help kind of convert folks who are visiting their site to the sales team, in addition to the components they built using Gatsby, doing the SEO strategy with Sanity and the content that they wrote. And so here's kind of what their architecture looks like. It's a little bit more of a complex architecture because, again, they had to integrate a sales team on the end, and they've got these kind of programmatic sources of data coming in to generate some pages. There's a blog post that kind of deep dives into this if you're curious for more. But the results were pretty outstanding, right? They saw this like 4x, 5x in conversion, which is just through the roof, right? That just fundamentally changes the trajectory of a business. And it all came from kind of, hey, a highly performant web framework, right? Great components that like take visitor interest and kind of really funnel them down through the funnel. So some lessons that kind of came out of here, right? First off, performance matters a lot. Again, performance is really key in driving conversions, and that's why a lot of folks choose to use Gatsby as the performance impact of using Gatsby. Again, kind of like watch the marketing analytics for like, just pay attention to how much they might, be slowing down your performance. And then also like, zooming out, right? I think a lot of times we're thinking, hey, I'm a developer, I'm a tech lead. My job is to kind of build the website. And that's true, right? But sometimes you need to zoom out and be like, well, the website is part of this broader business process. And so, maybe there's something else I can do that can kind of help optimize this process. That kind of thought trajectory led them down to a lot of the data work that they were doing for their client. Okay, cool. So awesome. This is, I think we've walked through a couple of examples, and we could have 3 or 4 examples and walk through all the various nuances of them. But I hope, I think we hope that just from these couple examples, really kind of lets you get inside the shoes or inside the head of these concrete the tech leads making decisions for these concrete projects, right? And there's a couple of if we zoom out, lessons that I want to kind of share. Actually, before we get there, do you have any other questions or comments about this project in specific? Want to wait a little bit before we sort of like fast forward on. Anyone have any? How long did that project take? So actually, the same thing. The project only took about a month. They were able to. The website does not have a lot of content types, so they were able to complete it relatively quickly and deliver these kind of incredible results. Yeah, Antonia says the thing that strikes me is always how many components make up an architecture. Yeah. I think you can kind of see just from the cover on this book, but I kind of try to put a lot of them on this cover. And then in chapter 8, I have another architecture diagram, which I won't open to, but it's actually maybe I will open to it, right? I think this is kind of the diagram that I made, and everything that you need to do on the web, there's often sort of like a specialized service for that thing, and that can result in a lot of pieces on this architecture diagram. It's worth it, because you get these results, but it can have a bit of complexity. Okay, let's. I don't see any more questions about this project in specific, so let's kind of keep going on, and then at the end we're going to kind of open it up again for more questions. First, first thing, if you're the tech lead, right? So again, this is kind of a sample architecture diagram of what a project might, of some various components that you might have in a project, and some. You can see some kind of pairwise integrations here of how different components are integrated or should be integrated with each other to kind of optimize the workflow for folks. If you're the tech lead, you're kind of the architect, right? So you're the one that's in charge of making these decisions. And, decisions can be made intentionally, or you can kind of sleepwalk into them. So, try to make them intentionally. Don't necessarily agonize over everyone, but do make them intentionally. We're here to help. So you take a screenshot of this if you want. There's just a number of links that we've written guides on kind of making each decision. Hey, how do you choose your CMS? What about e-commerce? How do you think about like content workflows, preview? So there's a lot of different. If you're thinking about a specific decision, we probably have like a blog post or a docs page on that specific decision. So read it, and hopefully that helps. So let's pause again, and what questions do folks have?
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Sam. And before we jump into questions real quick, I'm going to pop some links into the chat. So earlier in the webinar, Sam referenced a webinar that we did with Grayson, our senior software engineer, about achieving peak front-end performance. So I'm going to link that down there. If you just register, you can catch the replay of that webinar. Highly, highly recommend it. And I'm also going to link out to both the Jackson and the Wave Direct case studies, which dive into some further details that we didn't get into today. So definitely check out all 3 sources. I've just threw them into the chat. And then, of course, what Sam already mentioned in terms of our developer documentation, be sure to check those out. We spend a lot of time writing those up, so we want to ensure that they're valuable and that our audience is making use of it. So on that note, Sam, I think we're good to start with the questions. So
Sorry,
yes.
before we get into the questions, also just another note, I forgot to put this, but like we also work with teams to optimize their architecture. So if that's something that you're interested in, there's a contact us page on the website, and we'd be happy to chat about if that's a good fit for your team. Sorry, go for it, Neha. I was just wanted to make sure to say that before we jumped into the question.
Yeah, definitely. We're here to help folks, so get in touch with us. We have a question from Antonia. I'm currently learning more about architecture. It's such a big subject. How much work do you do investigating each variable?
I think it. Okay, that was. Apologies there. Yeah. So I think first off, it depends on sort of the project length. Is the big kind of factor for how long you spend on the architecture. It depends whether you've had kind of like experience, sometimes a lot of times what we've seen is that for an agency, they'll work through a project and they'll kind of figure things out over the course of the project, and then they'll have a good set of defaults for the projects they do after that. And they may alter one piece or another piece for the projects after that, but they tend to figure out a lot of things in the first project, and then after that they can mostly say, hey, we're just going to use these from now on unless there's a reason to choose a different one.
Awesome. Shrikant is asking, we have built some micro front ends with Angular framework with Gatsby framework. Can Angular and React components coexist?
Can Angular and React components coexist? I mean, it depends how you've set up your micro front end, I guess. If you you can set up Gatsby, you can configure Gatsby, and we have got a couple of guides on this in our docs, to only handle specific parts of the site. So for example, if you have a /products and you just want Gatsby to handle everything at /projects, and you have something else, whether that's Angular or WordPress, that handles the rest of the site, you can definitely configure Gatsby to do that, and you can configure your other framework or whatever to just kind of point those things over to Gatsby. I would recommend, my recommendation there is just have a plan for sort of like and sort of rules for which site sections go in Gatsby versus something else. Don't decide it on like a per page basis. That could be very kind of like confusing or difficult to configure. Try to decide it on like a site section basis instead.
We have a question here from Emmanuel. Building e-commerce with Woo and Gatsby would be best practice for adding the products to GraphQL and to store the cart. We've currently been using the Gatsby community plugin for Woo and stored the cart in Redux.
Let's see. So typically the way that I think you're going with a generally good approach, right? With e-commerce, it's important to you kind of have this global cart state, right? No matter what page you're on, you kind of have to persist that, cart global state somewhere. And so, Redux is a fine way of doing that. You can use React context is a good way as well. There are some performance implications for using Redux. We have a page on that as well. So if you want to use like React context, it might be like slightly better from a performance perspective. But I think your idea of storing global cart state is pretty good. The one thing I'd say on that one is, and I'm not as familiar with WooCommerce, but sometimes people like to persist the cart state. If someone's logged in, right? Maybe you want to persist the cart state to their account. And what that would let them do is, like, let's say they were logged in on desktop and then they went to mobile, it could persist it from desktop to mobile, right? Whereas if you're storing it globally on the site, that works great as long as they stay on the same device, but it doesn't transfer cross device. But I think, your approach, you're generally going in the right direction right now. And
we have a few more questions popping in here. What generic analytics system would you recommend for tracking that does not require cookies and cookie consent? What comes into consideration here? Plausible, Fathom, something else?
I would look at, I mean, yeah, I think the two ones you identified are fine. We have in general heard some folks who kind of go with one of these solutions, then realize 2 or 3 years down the line that they actually really need user specific analytics. So like Joel Hooks had something on Twitter, how he very much regrets kind of going with one of these privacy first, tools. But I mean, it's really kind of, it really just depends on the business use case that you have. If you don't need user specific data, then, by all means, do something like that.
We have another one here. Can we do a POC with Gatsby for like some product pages and the rest of the site in our current CMS/framework, Liferay?
Yeah, you can definitely do that. And in fact, I think that's often a great way that folks prototype when they're using an existing CMS system, is that they'll say, what if we just move this one site section over to Gatsby, to test it out? Because that's a way that they can kind of reduce risk. They're like, well, hey, redesigning the whole site, it's going to be like a huge amount of effort and it's a lot of risk. But what if we just move, what if maybe it's a big and complex site? Let's just move this one section over. And so you can definitely do that. Again, look at there's a couple docs around routing with that'll sort of like help you figure out how to configure that from the Gatsby side, like path prefixes are as the doc you need to look for. And then, you'll need to figure out from the Liferay, and I'm not as familiar with Liferay, how you sort of like configure Liferay to allow like to allow a specific site section to go somewhere else. And then you also want to decide, hey, is it like / products, or is it like products dot, do you use a subdomain or do you use like a section of your site? So that's another decision that you may want to think about.
Thanks, Sam. I'll ask you a few more and then I think we can start wrapping things up. So we have shortlisted Storyblock as a possible CMS, but I know it's not one of the most publicized by Gatsby. Is there a technical reason why, or is this a commercial decision? I believe someone else asked a similar question.
I'm sorry, I missed which CMS was that?
Storyblock.
Oh, we definitely see a lot of we haven't, I think we definitely see a lot of story blocking Gatsby projects. We haven't publicized that as much, but the integration is solid. And so there's been sort of a surge in story block usage recently, and I'm not sure if we've kind of captured that in our marketing or documentation as much yet. But definitely story block is, if you're doing story block, definitely feel free to use Gatsby. And we have some community members that are working at Storyblock and such.
And thanks, Ben, for popping in that link for everyone.
Oh, and also thanks for sharing your experience as well using Liferay. Yeah, often when you're sort of like splitting sites like that, like you are the solution that Alistair suggested was using Nginx proxy pass to sort of like route the traffic, and that's often that can often be a solution, is like if you're using Nginx, is like Nginx configuration to send some traffic in one way and some traffic in the other way.
Shrikant is asking. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's a general thing that folks have to figure out. It's not just Gatsby, it's kind of any headless solution of how you kind of like route traffic in that way.
Cool. Shrikant is asking, we have close to 1 million products which are available in a microservice accessible via APIs. Is static site generation recommended, especially build time? Is that a concern?
Yeah, so there's in the last couple of years, we've actually shipped a lot of features to help with this. We've shipped deferred site generation, for example, which lets you select a specific set of routes that you want to regenerate every time right up front, and then lets you delay or defer route generation for other for the rest of the routes. Or you could render some of the routes, using SSR. Gatsby will let you sort of select some pages to do SSG with, some pages to do SSR with, some pages to do DSG with, And to make this even, to throw another acronym at you, we call this kind of, we've also spent a lot of time on build time, and we've called this kind of like reactive site generation, which just basically means that when you edit a page, because we treat the page edits differently, so that we can rebuild the site for just a content edit in under 5 seconds for almost any size site. And so we call that reactive site generation. These are all things that are new in the last kind of year or two.
Awesome. If anyone has any final questions, now is the time to pop it in the chat. But otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us today. This has been super, super insightful. I think not only for folks joining us, but also for Sam and myself, hearing your questions pop up. I know it's really gotten me thinking about even upcoming webinars and blog posts that we can do. So thank you for that. On that note, about upcoming webinars, we do have another one on Thursday. Sam, do you want to tell everyone a little bit more about what they can expect from the webinar taking place this Thursday?
Yeah, so on Thursday, we're going to dive more into the people side of things, and the company and organizational journey side of things. So we were kind of focusing on the technical architecture and the systems that you choose. And this one's more about how do you think about structuring your team? What types of journeys are kind of companies on? And how does the modular web or Gatsby kind of play into each of these journeys? What kind of results can you expect over time? A year down the line, 3 years down the line, how does it affect the overall trajectory of the business? And then how, again, like when you change the tech stack, it might change how you think about hiring, right? It might change how you think about the skills that you need. So we're going to be diving in a lot more into those kinds of questions on Thursday.
Awesome. And I just threw the link in the chat for anyone that wants to join us, ask their questions on Thursday as it pertains to this topic. Otherwise, we will see you all next time. And if you know folks that would be, that would benefit from what we discussed today, please do share the link out to the webinar. They can just register for it and catch the replay. And all of you can also expect the recording in your inbox shortly. So thanks again, folks, and we'll see you Thursday, hopefully. Bye.
Thanks for coming.